A first crush is supposed to be one of the safest feelings a young person ever has. The racing heart, the saved messages, the daydream about a school dance. It usually marks the beginning of a larger life that is only just starting to open. For the girls in these cases, the person they liked, or the person they believed they were talking to, became the last face they ever saw. Some of them were in a school hallway on the morning of the prom. Some were asleep in a bedroom, slipping out to meet a boyfriend who did not exist. Some were in the back seat of a car, lured there by a rival who could not let go. Some were typing to a stranger at midnight who had spent months learning how to sound like love. Today, we are covering 10 teenage girls whose crushes ended in murder, and the ordinary wish to be wanted that turned into the thing that ended them. Section 1. Maren Sanchez. On the morning of Friday, April 24, 2014, Maren Sanchez had a blue prom dress waiting for her at home. She had posted a photograph of herself in it about a month earlier, and the dance was finally that evening, inside Jonathan Law High School in the small coastal city of Milford, Connecticut. She had helped plan the whole event. As junior class president, the prom belonged to her in the way that school traditions belong to the students who stay late to organize them. She was 16 years old. She had a boyfriend she was planning to go with. She had spent that week the way any 16-year-old spends the week before a night she helped build. Before the first bell had fully settled the building into its usual routine that morning, Maren Sanchez was lying on the floor of a secluded stairwell with stab wounds to her neck and torso, attacked by a classmate she had known for years, a boy who had asked her to that same prom and would not accept that she had said no. Maren Victoria Sanchez was born in Bridgeport, Connecticut, on August 26, 1997, and she grew up in Milford, a city that calls itself the small place with a big heart. By the time she reached her junior year, she had become one of the most recognizable students at Jonathan Law High School. She had served as class president as a freshman and a sophomore, and then again as a junior, which is the kind of streak that only happens when classmates genuinely like the person in front of them. She was an honors student and a member of the National Honor Society. She was co-manager of the school swim and softball teams. She played tennis. She belonged to the drama club. She sang, and she taught herself guitar, using lessons she found on the internet. She carried a camera everywhere and had served as the school photographer for the previous year's junior prom, which meant she had documented the very tradition she would later organize. She designed and sewed some of her own clothing. She built custom furniture for her bedroom. She had started a small dog walking business when she was 9 years old. She had volunteered at a veterans hospital. Her favorite color was purple, a detail that would later turn an entire community purple in her memory. The people who raised her were spread across 2 states. Her mother, Donna Cimarelli Sanchez, lived in Milford. Her father, Jose Sanchez, lived in Miami, Florida, where Maren also had 2 siblings. She had grandparents in Bridgeport and in Miami. By every account given by the people who knew her, Maren was the sort of teenager adults described as destined for something larger, the kind of student teachers remember by name a decade later. Her mother would later describe her as a partner in crime and a best friend and the greatest joy of her life. None of that was unusual praise invented after a tragedy. It was the same thing classmates, teachers, and neighbors had been saying about her while she was alive. The boy who killed her was named Christopher Plascon. He was also 16, also a junior at Jonathan Law, and the 2 of them had known each other for a long time. Reports in the immediate aftermath described their connection in different ways, with some calling Plascon a former boyfriend, and others describing a long-standing friendship between classmates. And the detail that stays consistent across the record is simpler than either label. Plascon had asked Maren to be his date to the junior prom, and Maren had turned him down. She was planning to go with her boyfriend. That refusal, ordinary and final in the way teenage social life is full of small refusals, sat at the center of everything that followed. What was building inside Plascon in the weeks before the prom did not announce itself in any way that the people around Maren could act on in time. According to allegations later raised in a wrongful death lawsuit filed by Maren's mother, Maren had gone to the school's guidance department months earlier with a concern that Plascon had talked about harming himself with a knife, and the lawsuit alleged that the information was passed between counselors but never escalated to authorities in the way school policy and state law required. Court documents in the criminal case described something colder. They stated that Plascon had allegedly told a friend that he would not mind if Maren was dead or was hit by a bus. The foundation Maren's mother later built would describe Maren as a young woman who had been subjected to manipulation and stalking. The full interior picture of what Plascon was thinking in those final weeks has never been laid out cleanly in public, and his own defense would later argue that mental illness, not a simple rejection, was the engine underneath it. What is not in dispute is that the rejection of a prom invitation was the last thing that passed between them before the morning of the dance. The attack happened in the early part of the school day, as students were arriving and the hallways were filling. Maren was in a first-floor stairwell, a secluded spot away from the main flow of the building. Plascon found her there. For roughly 33 seconds, the two of them were alone in that stairwell, a span of time the state's attorney would later hold up in court as the entire duration of the violence. In that half a minute, Plascon pushed Maren, choked her, and stabbed her repeatedly with a kitchen knife, cutting her throat and inflicting multiple wounds to her torso. The state's attorney would describe what happened in that stairwell as a vicious murder and a barbarous act, and would emphasize how little time it had taken to end a life that so many people had described as full of promise. The 33 seconds did not pass unwitnessed. Another student came upon the attack and tried to pull Plascon off of Maren, an attempt that failed against what was already in motion. A second witness saw Plascon discard the bloody knife. Within moments, the stairwell was no longer a secret place. Plascon was taken to the principal's office, his clothing covered in blood, and he told the police who arrived that he had done it and that they should arrest him. He did not run. He did not deny it. He delivered the confession in the flat, immediate way of someone who had already crossed the line he had walked into the building intending to cross. Staff members and paramedics worked on Maren inside the school, and she was rushed to a hospital where she was pronounced dead a short time later. She had been stabbed to death inside her own high school on the day of the prom she had helped plan by a classmate she had known for years over an invitation she had declined. The chief medical examiner ruled the death a homicide and identified the cause as stab wounds to the torso and neck. The prom scheduled for that evening was postponed. The blue dress hanging at home would never be worn. The investigation that followed was not a search for a suspect. Plascon had confessed at the scene, in front of police, in bloody clothes. What the case became instead was a long argument over what should be done with a 16-year-old who had killed another 16-year-old inside a school. He was initially handled as a juvenile offender, and his case was then moved so that he could be prosecuted as an adult. He was held at the Manson Youth Institution in Cheshire, Connecticut, on a $3 million bond. In the period after the stabbing, he was placed in a psychiatric facility for evaluation, and his attorneys began assembling a defense built around his mental state. They filed notice that they intended to argue he had been suffering from a mental disease or defect, or extreme emotional disturbance, at the time of the killing. One of his attorneys argued publicly that the case should not be understood as a young man lashing out over a rejected prom invitation, and instead pointed to a boy who he said had quietly and silently suffered from some degree of mental illness. The defense weighed an insanity defense and pointed to signs of psychosis. The criminal case moved slowly through the Connecticut courts over the next 2 years. In the end, Plascon did not go to a full trial. Facing a deadline on a plea offer and the alternative of a 3-judge trial, he accepted the offer and pleaded no contest to murder in March of 2016. A no-contest plea meant he did not formally admit guilt, but accepted that the state had enough evidence to convict him, and it carried the legal weight of a conviction. Prosecutors had said they would seek a sentence of 25 years. The plea closed off the possibility of the case being decided by a panel of judges and set the matter for sentencing. The sentencing took place on June 6, 2016, in Milford Superior Court, before Judge John Ronan. Plascon, by then 19 years old, chose not to address the court. His attorney apologized to the Sanchez family on behalf of his client and his client's family. The courtroom was filled with the families and friends of both teenagers, two groups of people who had once lived in the same small city and now sat on opposite sides of an impossible morning. The state's attorney told the court that the sentence was the best outcome that could be hoped for given the facts, the defendant's age at the time of the crime, and recent changes in Connecticut law governing how juveniles are sentenced in serious cases. The judge handed down 25 years and called the sentence appropriate, just, and fair. The most piercing moments of that hearing did not come from the lawyers. Maren's mother stood in the courtroom and refused to spend her time discussing the boy who had killed her daughter. She talked about Maren instead. She told the court that Maren had been the love of her life, her best friend, and a young woman who was destined for greatness. She described a daughter who had taught herself guitar from the internet, who had started a dog-walking business at 9, who had volunteered her time at a veterans hospital, who had invented and built and sewn and organized. She said the blows in that stairwell had been meant to silence Maren, and that they would not succeed. And she announced that she would build a foundation in her daughter's name. She told the room that Maren was in her soul and walked with her every day. Maren's father, Jose Sanchez, spoke as well, and his grief carried a sharper edge. He recalled Maren's very first day of kindergarten, when she had come home crying because another child on the bus had picked on her, and how the next morning he had walked his daughter to the bus and stepped aboard to look at the child who had upset her. This time, he told the judge, he had not been able to be there for her, and he said he lived with that every day of his life. He called the sentence too lenient. He said his daughter was not walking out of her grave, and that he and her mother would not get her back. He said he felt the family was being sentenced again, because under the new juvenile sentencing rules, Plascon would become eligible for parole well before the full 25 years had passed. The judge told Maren's parents that parole was a possibility, and that they would be notified if and when Plascon became eligible, and that they would be allowed to speak at that time. Plascon was sent to serve his sentence at the Manson Youth Institution. Because he had been a minor at the time of the crime, and under the reformed Connecticut laws on juvenile offenders, he was set to become eligible for parole after serving a portion of the term rather than the whole thing, a calculation that placed his first possible parole consideration roughly 13 years out. The arithmetic that so wounded Maren's father was straightforward and public. A boy who had taken a life inside a school could, in theory, walk back into the world while still in his early 30s, possibly with a college education earned behind the walls, while the girl he killed would remain 16 forever. The community of Milford did not wait for the courts to begin grieving. On the night the prom was supposed to have happened, Maren's classmates gathered at Walnut Beach for a vigil, and many of them wore the prom dresses and gowns they had bought for the dance. In a photograph that traveled far beyond Connecticut, a group of those students stood together holding Maren's own prom dress, the one she would never wear. A memorial service was held at a Milford church. Days later, hundreds gathered at the school for an evening vigil where recordings of Maren singing were played for the crowd. That autumn, a memorial garden was dedicated behind Jonathan Law High School, filled with purple flowers and set with 2 benches and stained glass, placed on a hill that overlooked the softball field she had helped manage. On the first anniversary, more than 600 people came to an event called Peace, Love and Music from Maren, and the city turned purple again for a memorial run held in her honor. Out of the sentencing came the foundation Maren's mother had promised. The Maren Sanchez Home Foundation was built to educate and empower young women to recognize manipulation, to defend themselves against physical and emotional abuse, and to understand the red flags that can precede violence, along with support for the classmates left carrying survivors' guilt because they had known how Maren felt and could not stop what happened. A scholarship fund in Maren's name began awarding money to graduating seniors at Milford's high schools. The legal aftermath stretched on for years. Maren's mother brought a wrongful death lawsuit against Plascon, his parents, the city of Milford, and its school district, arguing in part that warnings about Plascon's mental state had not been acted on. The claims against Plascon and his parents were settled, with reporting placing that portion at $1.6 million, and in 2019, the city of Milford agreed to pay Maren's estate $5 million, even as the city had argued there was nothing it could have done to prevent the attack. What remains in the public record about Maren Sanchez is the shape of a life that had barely started to unfold and a single morning that ended it. A junior class president who organized her own prom and never reached the dance. A self-taught musician and photographer and builder and seamstress who was, by the account of nearly everyone who knew her, headed somewhere remarkable. A blue dress that hung untouched. A boy she had known for years who asked her a question, received the answer no, and carried a kitchen knife into a school stairwell because of it. Maren Sanchez was 16 years old. She would have graduated with the Jonathan Law class of 2015. The garden of purple flowers behind the school still overlooks the softball field, and the people of Milford still gather in her colour. And the boy who killed her will one day stand before a parole board, while the girl he killed remains exactly the age she was on the morning of her prom. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Maren Sanchez was taken inside the one place a teenager is told is safe, by a boy who could not accept a simple no. The next case moves to upstate New York, where 17-year-old Bianca Devins met a man through her phone who seemed, for a while, like the beginning of something, until the night he turned the relationship into a crime that the whole internet was forced to witness. Section 2. Bianca Devins. On the second Sunday of July in 2019, the city of Utica, New York, was preparing to do the thing it does best. The Boilermaker, one of the largest road races in the country, draws tens of thousands of runners and spectators into the streets of the small upstate city every July, and the morning of July 14 was supposed to belong to them. Somewhere in that same city, 17-year-old Bianca Devins had just come home from her first real adult outing, a concert in New York City the night before, the first show she had ever gone to without her mother. She had recently graduated from high school. She was getting ready to start at a local community college in the fall. She was an artist, an aspiring model, a girl her own mother described as kinder and stronger than she herself could ever be. By the time the runners were lining up for the Boilermaker that morning, Bianca Devins was dead on a street called Poe, her throat cut by a 21-year-old man who had spent the previous 2 months making himself a fixture in her life and her family's home. And within minutes, the photographs he took of her body had been pushed out across the internet, where strangers would pass them around for years. Bianca Michelle Devins was born on October 2, 2001, and she grew up in Utica with her mother, Kimberly, and her younger sister, Olivia. Her mother had been a teenager herself when Bianca was born, and in many ways the two of them had grown up together, close enough that the family thought of one another as best friends. Bianca was the kind of daughter people kept writing to her mother about even after she was gone, because she had a habit of helping people and giving advice, and making the person in front of her feel less alone. She had a talent for art and photography. She loved her cat, Belle. She loved to swing. Her favorite colors were lavender and pink, and she wore her hair in soft colors to match. She had built a presence online, sharing her photographs and her art and her selfies, and she had gathered a following large enough that the press would later attach the word influencer to her name. Though the truer picture underneath the following was a thoughtful teenager working through her own struggles and reaching out to other young people doing the same. The man who entered her life was named Brandon Andrew Clark. He was 21 years old and from the Syracuse area, and the two of them had met online, through Instagram, roughly 2 months before the murder. In the weeks that followed, Clark did not stay a distant online acquaintance. He spent time with Bianca in person. He became familiar with her family. He was, by her mother's later account, at the house often, and the first impression he gave was an entirely ordinary one. Kimberly Devins described him as nice and personable, the sort of polite, nerdy young man who reads as harmless, and she has said plainly that the family had no idea what he was planning. The exact nature of the relationship between Clark and Bianca has never been settled cleanly in the record. Police reports described an intimate relationship. Bianca's sister later called Clark a close family friend. Others around her feared he was something more troubling, an older man who had attached himself to a teenage girl and wanted from her something she had not agreed to give. What is clear is that Clark believed the relationship was more than Bianca did, and that the gap between his version and hers was the ground everything else grew out of. The night that ended it began as something Bianca had been looking forward to for weeks. On July 13, 2019, she went to a concert in Queens, New York, a show by an artist she liked, and Clark took her. Her mother remembered both of them getting ready, and Bianca being simply, completely happy, excited about her first adult concert and her first taste of that kind of freedom. At the concert, Clark saw Bianca kiss another person. Whatever he had been telling himself about what the two of them were to each other, the kiss broke it. After the show, on the long drive back upstate to Utica in the early hours of the morning, he raised the kiss with her, and she answered him the way she had apparently been answering him all along, by reminding him that the two of them were only friends. The argument settled. Bianca, exhausted from the night, fell asleep in the back seat of his car. What the evidence and his own recording later revealed about the next stretch of that drive is the part that turns the case from a tragedy into something colder and more deliberate. While Bianca slept in the back seat, Clark set up a camera on the dashboard of the car. He woke her. Before she fully understood what was happening, he had a knife to her neck. He cut her throat and killed her, and he recorded the entire thing, including her final moments. The recording, a video that ran roughly 15 minutes, was later described by the Oneida County District Attorney, a man with 3 decades in the office, as the most disturbing thing he had ever seen. The investigators also found, at the scene and elsewhere, the signs that this had not been a sudden loss of control. Knives, rope, other tools. A letter that appeared to be a suicide note, left at a relative's home. The picture the physical evidence painted was of a plan, carried into the car, waiting for a trigger. The video of the killing never reached the internet. The photographs did. After Bianca was dead, Clark uploaded images of her body to social media, including the gaming chat platform Discord, and attached a message taunting the young men who had followed her online. From there, the images spread with a speed and cruelty that is difficult to absorb. They appeared on Instagram. They appeared on anonymous image boards. Strangers set the photographs as their profile pictures and posted them onto Bianca's own feed. Some people circulated them as a joke, some celebrated. Pockets of the internet treated the murder of a 17-year-old girl as content, and the people who loved her watched it happen in real time, because the images of the worst moment of her life were arriving on the same screens where, a day earlier, she had been posting her art. The crime was discovered through those very posts. On the morning of July 14, the Oneida County Dispatch Center began receiving calls around 7:20 a.m. from people reporting that a man had just posted online that he had killed someone. Police traced the scene to Poe Street in Utica, a location close enough to the Boilermaker course that the race had to be delayed while officers and medics rushed in. The first officer to arrive found Clark near a tarp holding a knife. He had built a small bonfire. He had called friends and family. As the officer approached, Clark cut his own throat and lay down across the tarp, still photographing himself with his phone. Beneath the tarp was Bianca's body. The murder had been designed in his mind to end in his own death as well, but the responding police and rescue personnel kept him alive. He survived the wound he gave himself. Bianca did not survive the one he had given her. Clark was charged with second-degree murder and indicted in July of 2019. At first, he pleaded not guilty, and the case was set to head toward a trial on the murder charge. Then, on February 10, 2020, he changed course and pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, a plea that spared Bianca's family from sitting through a trial that would have forced the most graphic details of the killing, including that 15-minute video, into open court. In the courtroom that day, he said that he understood he could not undo what he had done, no matter how much he wanted to. The plea did not bring the case to a clean close. Months later, Clark tried to take it back, claiming he had been denied effective legal counsel and pressured into the plea. He was given a new attorney in August of 2020. He formally moved to withdraw the guilty plea. In October of 2020, the judge denied the request and let the plea stand. The sentencing was pushed back more than once, including a delay caused by a coronavirus outbreak at the county correctional facility where Clark was held, and it finally took place on March 16, 2021. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, the term that had been expected since his guilty plea. The most powerful words spoken in that proceeding came from Bianca's younger sister, Olivia, who told the court about the version of Bianca she is left with. Other people, she said, get to remember her sister as she was. She, on the other hand, sees the horrific photograph of Bianca because strangers made sure she would. She described users posting that image onto Bianca's feed, setting it as their own profile pictures, sending it to her directly. She had been forced to delete her social media accounts, and the photographs kept coming anyway. Bianca's mother has spoken about the same wound. The worst part, she has said, is not only the loss of her daughter, but the loss of the everyday things that came with her. The hugs and the kisses and the I love yous, replaced by an inbox that periodically fills with the image of her dead child. Clark was sent to a New York State prison, later held at the Attica Correctional Facility, and under his sentence he is not eligible for parole until 2044. In 2025, the New York State Appellate Division denied his attempt to overturn the guilty plea and the sentence, leaving both in place. The man who recorded a teenager's murder and turned the images into bait for an online audience will spend at least the core of his life behind bars, while the audience he was performing for scattered back into the same anonymous spaces where the photographs still occasionally surface. The aftermath of Bianca's death became, almost immediately, a fight her family did not choose. Because the images would not stop circulating, her mother turned her grief into a campaign to change how platforms handle the photographs of murder victims. She worked alongside lawmakers on what came to be called Bianca's Law, an early federal version introduced by a former local congressman in 2020, aimed to require major platforms to maintain offices dedicated to finding and removing graphic, violent content, and it failed to gain traction in Washington. The family kept pushing at the state level, and at the end of 2022, the governor of New York signed Bianca's Law, paired with a measure inspired by an earlier case, creating criminal and civil penalties for the unlawful dissemination of a personal image of a person with the intent to harm that person or their family. It gave families a legal tool that had not existed when Bianca was killed. A separate lawsuit the family brought against the county district attorney's office was dismissed in 2022. The family has refused to let the photographs be the last word on who Bianca was. Her mother has said plainly that she wants to tell the world about Bianca, the real one, the artist and the aspiring model, and the kind, funny, advice-giving girl who lit up the people around her. The family hosts an annual gathering in her memory. They award scholarships in her name, including support for students studying psychology, a field that touches the struggles Bianca herself had been navigating. They display her artwork in community exhibits so that her photographs, the ones she chose to share, can outlast the ones that were stolen from her. They wear lavender and pink. They speak about her in the present tense, because to do otherwise, in their view, would be to let the people who shared the images win a second time. What stays in the public record about Bianca Devins is the collision between an ordinary teenage want and a grown man's refusal to accept the answer. A 17-year-old who had just graduated, who had gone to her first concert without her mother, who kissed someone at a show the way teenagers do, and who reminded the man driving her home that they were only ever friends. A man 11 days past her age in years but a world apart in intent, who had brought a knife and a rope and a camera and a plan, and who decided that if he could not have the version of her that lived in his head, he would turn her death into a spectacle for strangers. Bianca Devins was 17 years old. Her mother still wakes some mornings to a stranger tagging her in the worst moment of her daughter's life, and she still answers it the only way she has found to answer it, by saying Bianca's name out loud and refusing to let her be remembered as anything other than the person she actually was. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Bianca Devins met danger through a screen and welcomed it into her home without ever knowing what it was. The next case moves to a quiet town outside Boston, where 18-year-old Lauren Astley had done everything right, ended a relationship that had run its course, and stayed kind to the boy she left, never imagining that the breakup itself was the thing that would cost her life. Section 3. Lauren Astley. On the morning of Monday, July 4, 2011, a man riding his bicycle along a marshy stretch off Water Row in Wayland, Massachusetts, saw something in the reeds that did not belong there. The thing in the marsh was the body of an 18-year-old girl named Lauren Astley. She had been out of high school for roughly a month. She had her college plans set, a place waiting for her at Elon University in North Carolina that fall. She had a summer job at the mall, a circle of friends she had grown up with, an a cappella group she sang in, a French horn she had studied for years. She had spent the previous day the way an 18-year-old spends a summer Sunday, a sleepover with her best friend, a visit with her father, a shift at work. By the time the sun came up over the holiday weekend, All of it was over. Ended in the garage of a house she had once treated as a second home, by a boy she had dated for 3 years, and had recently, kindly, decided to stop dating. Lauren Dunn Astley was born in Boston on April 1, 1993, and she spent her entire life in Wayland, a quiet middle-class suburb of about 13,000 people west of the city. She was a member of the Wayland High School class of 2011 and had graduated only weeks before her death. By every account from the people who knew her, she was the kind of teenager a town remembers. She was an accomplished tennis player. She sang with the Muses, the school's female a cappella group, and friends would later point to a recording of her standing at the center of the group, with her own microphone, as the image that captured her best. She studied French horn under a local teacher and played in a regional youth symphony. For 8 years, she went to a summer camp in New Hampshire, first as a camper and then as a counselor, the natural progression of a girl other people trusted with younger kids. Her closest friends described her as smart, funny, a talented singer, and a loyal friend. The sort of person who held a friendship together rather than letting it drift. Her parents, Mary Dunn and Malcolm Astley, were fixtures in the Wayland community and members of the local Unitarian Universalist Church. Lauren had a life that, by any reasonable measure, was set up to keep getting better. College in the fall, a summer to enjoy first, the whole open stretch of being 18, and finished with high school, and not yet anywhere near the responsibilities that come later. The boy she had been dating was named Nathaniel Fujita, known to everyone as Nate. He was also 18, also a member of the class of 2011, a football player at Wayland High, and the son of a well-regarded local music teacher. The two of them had been together for 3 years, long enough that the families had grown close, long enough that Lauren had once interviewed Nate's father for a school project. They had gone to prom together. By the standards of high school, theirs had been a serious, established relationship, the kind that classmates simply expected to see continuing. The fracture came in April of 2011, when Lauren ended the relationship. There is nothing in the public record to suggest she did it cruelly, or that there had been any history of abuse during the years they dated. Investigators later said there was no indication Fujita had ever been violent with her while they were together. Lauren broke up with him the way relationships end all the time, because she was 18, headed to college, and ready to move on. What followed in the weeks after the breakup was visible to the people around them, even if no one understood what it meant. Fujita pulled back from his friends. He grew quieter and angrier. The outgoing, familiar version of him that classmates had known seemed to recede into someone they recognized less and less. Friends would later describe an on-again, off-again pattern in the weeks after the split, with Fujita trying to talk to Lauren, trying to pull her back, and Lauren staying in contact with him the way a kind person stays in contact with someone they used to love. That kindness, the ordinary decency of not cutting someone off coldly, would later be turned against her. The last full day of Lauren's life was Sunday, July 3, 2011. She had spent the night before at a sleepover with her best friend, Genevieve Flynn, who dropped her off the next morning. Lauren went to meet her father, then headed to her summer job at the mall in nearby Natick. The day was unremarkable in the way that last days so often are, full of small, ordinary errands by a girl with a whole summer in front of her. In the days before, she and Fujita had still been texting, an exchange the defense would later point to in court. At some point that evening, after Lauren finished her shift, Fujita drew her to his house at 108 West Plain Street. He had chosen a time when his parents would not be home. He had her park her car somewhere out of sight, a detail prosecutors would later hold up as evidence that this was not a sudden eruption but a setup, arranged so that no neighbor would see her vehicle and no one would know she was there. What happened inside the garage of that house took the form prosecutors would describe to a jury 2 years later. Fujita strangled Lauren with a ligature, a bungee cord pulled around her neck, and he slashed her throat. She was 18 years old. She had come to the home of the boy she had dated for 3 years because he asked her to, because she had no reason in the world to believe that the person she had once trusted completely would do what he did. After she was dead, Fujita did not panic into the open. He cleaned the blood from the garage floor. He hid the clothing he had been wearing. He moved her body into a vehicle, drove to the marshy area off Water Row at the edge of town, and left her in the reeds. Then he went back to the life of a teenager whose girlfriend had simply gone missing for a night. The mask did not hold for long. When the bicyclist found Lauren's body the next morning, the investigation moved quickly toward the person closest to her. Investigators executing a search warrant at Fujita's house found bungee cords and found blood on the floor of the garage. The physical evidence lined up with the wounds on Lauren's body: an incised wound to the neck and strangulation by ligature, which the medical examiner identified as the cause of death. Fujita was arrested on July 5, 2011, 2 days after the killing, and held without bail. In August, a grand jury indicted him on first-degree murder along with assault charges, and he was arraigned later that month. He would remain in custody from his arrest forward. The case did not reach trial until the winter of 2013, after a series of delays tied in part to the defense's decision to pursue an insanity strategy and to a period when Fujita considered changing attorneys. When the trial finally opened at Middlesex Superior Court in Woburn, the central fact was never contested. Fujita's own lawyer did not dispute that his client had killed Lauren Astley. The fight was over why, and over whether Fujita could be held criminally responsible for what he had done. The defense argued that Fujita had been suffering from major depressive disorder and had experienced a psychotic episode at the time of the killing, and pointed to his daily marijuana use and to repeated head injuries he had sustained playing football, arguing that the combination left him unable to understand that his actions were wrong. A relative testified about a history of mental illness in the family. A forensic psychiatrist for the defense told the jury Fujita had lacked the capacity to know that what he was doing was wrong. The prosecution told a different story, and it built that story out of the details of how the killing had been arranged. The lead prosecutor argued that Fujita was not a young man lost in a fog he could not control, and instead described someone acting out of rage at having been left, someone who had planned. She pointed to the timing chosen for when the parents would be away, to Lauren being asked to hide her car, to the strangling and the stabbing, and then to the deliberate cleanup that followed, the blood wiped away and the bloody clothes hidden. A psychiatrist for the prosecution testified that Fujita had acted out of rage and had understood what he was doing. During closing arguments, the prosecutor held a bungee cord against her own neck in front of the jury to show how she said Lauren had been killed, a moment that made the abstraction of the charge suddenly physically real in the courtroom. The jury of 4 women and 8 men deliberated for about 7 hours over 2 days. On March 7, 2013, the foreman announced that Fujita, by then 20 years old, was guilty of first-degree murder. He hung his head as the verdict was read, his face empty. Lauren's mother broke down in tears. A first-degree murder conviction in Massachusetts carries a single automatic sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole, and that is the sentence Fujita received. There would be no parole hearings in his future, no calculation of years served against years remaining. The door closed completely. What happened in that courtroom after the verdict became, in its own quiet way, one of the most remarkable details of the entire case. Lauren's father, Malcolm Astley, crossed the space between the families and shared a sobbing embrace with Nate Fujita's parents. He had not come to the verdict carrying a desire for vengeance against the family of the boy who had killed his daughter, and he never would. People who know him have traced that restraint to how he was raised, by parents who worked in mental health and who taught him, when he encountered behavior he could not understand, to look beneath the anger for the thing driving it. In the years after the trial, Fujita's mental health deteriorated badly in custody. For a stretch between 2015 and 2017, he was found mute and unresponsive in his cell, was treated with antipsychotic medication, and spent months in a secure psychiatric unit. His attorneys would continue to pursue appeals, including a motion for a new trial and later filings arguing errors in the proceedings, and the conviction has continued to stand through those challenges. The grief in Wayland did not wait for the legal process. Lauren's memorial service drew more than 1,500 people to the family's church, a crowd so large that it spilled into the church basement and out onto the lawn and had to be broadcast into another building across the street to hold the overflow. Within a week of her death, while the case was still raw and unsolved in the public mind, her parents established the Lauren Dunn Astley Memorial Fund. They gave it a 3-part mission that reflected who their daughter had been: the promotion of healthy teen relationships, the arts, and community service. A benefit celebrating Lauren's life helped the fund reach roughly $190,000. What her parents understood, almost immediately, was that the thing that had killed Lauren was not unique to Wayland, and not a freak event that could be filed away. It was a pattern, repeated across the country, that almost no one was talking to teenagers about. In the years that followed, Malcolm Astley and Mary Dunn turned that understanding into a mission that has lasted well over a decade. They have spoken at more than 250 schools, colleges, and community organizations. They have met with governors. The fund supports programs that begin with fifth graders, starting with the building blocks of healthy friendship and progressing through high school into frank conversations about dating violence. Astley has spent years repeating a statistic that most people would rather not hold in their heads, that 2 to 3 girls and women are killed by intimate partners in the United States nearly every day, the overwhelming majority of them by boys and men. He has described the work as the thing that pulls him out of what he calls a deep despair over the loss. He has been blunt about the warning signs, telling people that when one person's world begins to shrink inside a relationship, that is itself the problem, and that the right response is to reach out to a trusted peer or adult who knows where help can be found. After Lauren's death, her own school district re-examined how it taught students about healthy relationships and dating violence. What stays in the public record about Lauren Astley is the gap between how ordinary the ending of her relationship was and how total the violence that followed it became. A 3-year high school relationship that ran its course. An 18-year-old girl who broke up with her boyfriend in the spring, the way countless 18-year-olds do, and who then stayed kind to him because that was the kind of person she was. A boy who could not absorb the fact that she had moved on, who chose a night when no one would be watching, who asked her to hide her car, and who used the trust she still extended him to bring her into a garage she never walked out of. Lauren Astley was 18 years old. She had a college dorm waiting for her in North Carolina that she never reached. Her parents turned a marsh in Wayland into a starting point for a conversation they have now carried to hundreds of schools, and the recording of her singing with her group still plays at the bottom of the page they built in her name. A girl at the center of a semicircle of friends, her voice exactly as it was the spring before she died. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Lauren Astley was killed by someone she had loved and trusted for 3 years, undone by nothing more than her decision to move on. The next case moves to the mountains of Virginia, where a 13-year-old girl named Nicole Lovell slipped out her bedroom window after dark to meet a boy she had been messaging, a boy she believed was a little older and a little sweet, and who turned out to be neither. Section 4. Nicole Lovell. Sometime in the dark, snowy early hours of Wednesday, January 27, 2016, in Blacksburg, Virginia, a 13-year-old girl named Nicole Lovell pushed a piece of furniture against her bedroom door, opened her window, and climbed out into the cold. She took 2 things with her cell phone and a blue blanket printed with the cartoon minions she loved. She left behind the one thing that kept her alive, the anti-rejection medication she needed every single day so that the liver she had been given as an infant would not fail. She walked across the snow toward a car that was waiting for her, driven by a boy she had been messaging for months. An 18-year-old college student she had told her younger neighbors was her boyfriend. By the time her mother went to her room the next morning to give her that medicine, Nicole was gone, and within a few days her body would be found across the state line in North Carolina, beside a remote road, with 14 stab wounds, the work of a young man who had decided that the simplest way to keep their relationship secret was to make sure she could never tell anyone about it. Nicole Madison Lovell was born on May 3, 2002, in Radford City, Virginia, and from the very beginning her life was a fight to stay in it. She was born with a damaged liver and needed a transplant before her first birthday. The illness never fully let go. As a young child, she was diagnosed with lymphoma, spent roughly 6 months in a coma after a respiratory condition, and survived a drug-resistant bacterial infection. She pulled through all of it every time, but the survival came at a cost that followed her into adolescence. She had scars on her stomach and a tracheotomy scar on her neck, and she had to take medication every day to keep her transplanted liver working. By 13, she was a 7th grader at Blacksburg Middle School, and she carried the kind of loneliness that does not show up in a yearbook photo. Classmates teased her about her weight and about her scars. She hated going to school so much that her mother sometimes simply kept her home, and the bullying followed her onto her phone anyway. Her social media posts revealed a girl who felt unloved, who had struggled with dark thoughts, who longed for someone to see her. She was also, in the ways that mattered, still a child. She loved pandas. She kept toys from the Minions movies in her bedroom. She wanted to sing and talked about being on a televised singing competition someday. The day before she disappeared, she had gone sledding with a neighbor's 8-year-old twin daughters, a 13-year-old still happy to play in the snow with much younger kids. Her mother, Tammy Weeks, worked as a nurse and had raised Nicole largely on her own, with help from Nicole's grandparents. Nicole's father had been in and out of jail and was barely present in her life. Tammy doted on her daughter, bought her what she wanted, and tried to fill the gaps that her health and her isolation had carved out. What Tammy could not do was follow her daughter into the place where the danger actually lived, which was the screen in her hands. On the messaging app Kik and across other social media, Nicole did what a lonely teenager longing to be wanted does. She looked for connection. She found a user who paid attention to her, and over a period of months an online relationship formed. The person on the other end was David Eisenhower, an 18-year-old freshman at Virginia Tech, an engineering student and a college track athlete from Maryland. To the people who knew him on campus, he read as quiet and unremarkable. What he was doing in private was cultivating a relationship with a 13-year-old child, one that eventually moved from the phone into person. Nicole, for her part, treated it as something thrilling and grown up. She told the 8-year-old girls she had been sledding with that she had a boyfriend named David, that he was 18, that she had met him online, and that she was going to sneak out that night to see him. She showed them text messages. To her, it was a secret romance. To him, as prosecutors would later lay out, it had become a problem to be solved. The thing that turned the relationship lethal was exposure. According to the prosecution, Eisenhower feared what would happen if it became known that an 18-year-old college student had been involved with a 13-year-old girl. He confided to a friend, fellow Virginia Tech freshman Natalie Keepers, that he was worried Nicole might be pregnant, and told her that he may have had sex with Nicole at a party, but could not remember because he had blacked out. Out of that fear grew a plan. Keepers told police that she and Eisenhower had discussed various ways to kill Nicole. The day before Nicole vanished, Eisenhower spent about half an hour online researching knockout drugs and the methods law enforcement uses to identify a body. That same day, store security footage captured Eisenhower and Keepers buying a shovel. The decision to end Nicole's life was made in advance, calmly, by 2 college students treating a child as a loose end. The night of January 27 narrowed everything down to a few quiet movements in a sleeping house. Nicole pushed her nightstand against her bedroom door, something she sometimes did when she wanted privacy, and slipped out her window with her phone and her Minions blanket. She left her medication on the nightstand, the clearest possible sign that she believed she would be back before morning, that this was a secret date and nothing more. She walked out to where Eisenhower was waiting in his car. The GPS in that car would later place him near her home at exactly that time. He drove her away from the neighborhood to a wooded area in Montgomery County. In those woods, Eisenhower stabbed Nicole to death. The medical examiner would later count 14 stab wounds, including a lethal wound to her neck. She was 13 years old, a girl who had survived a liver transplant and lymphoma, and a coma, and a drug-resistant infection, killed in the snow by a person she thought liked her. What followed showed the same cold practicality as the planning. Eisenhower and Keepers moved Nicole's body across the state line into Surry County, North Carolina, and left her beside a remote road roughly 80 miles south of her home. Then, with her body still in the trunk of the car, the 2 of them went to a store and bought cleaning supplies: a cleaner, bleach, disinfectant wipes, and 2 pairs of gloves, the materials they would use to try to scrub the evidence of what they had done out of the vehicle. The discovery began with a mother and a missed routine. When Tammy Weeks went to her daughter's room the next morning to give Nicole her anti-rejection medicine, she had to push the door against the nightstand to get in. The window was open. Nicole was gone, and the medication she could not live without had been left behind. Tammy called Nicole's phone over and over, and the calls went straight to voicemail. She called friends. She went to neighbors' houses. A neighborhood mother gave her the first piece of the truth, telling her that Nicole had said she was going to sneak out to meet someone. Tammy called the police. What followed was an intense 3-day search across Blacksburg, joined by community members and by members of the Virginia Tech Corps of Cadets, while investigators began pulling apart Nicole's social media accounts, and friends told them about the secret boyfriend and the secret date. On the Saturday after she vanished, Nicole's body was found in North Carolina. The physical evidence closed in on the two students quickly. Blood was found in Eisenhower's car, along with a bloodied shovel and cleaning supplies. Nicole's blood was in the trunk. Eisenhower's DNA was recovered from under Nicole's fingernails. Nicole's bag and her minion's blanket were located in connection with Keepers. Eisenhower was arrested within days, and Keepers was arrested shortly after him. Both were held without bond at the county jail. The fact that the two suspects were college students at one of the state's flagship universities, one of them a former intern at a major space agency, made the case national news, and the gap between how ordinary their lives had looked and what they had done became its own kind of horror. Eisenhower's trial opened in February of 2018 at the Montgomery County Circuit Court in Christiansburg. His own attorney, in opening statements, tried to shift the blame toward Keepers, suggesting she could have been the one who actually killed Nicole. The prosecution laid out the months of online contact, the fear of exposure, the research into how to render someone unconscious and how bodies are identified, the purchased shovel, and the forensic trail. On the fourth day of testimony, after data recovered from his phone was presented in court, Eisenhower changed course and entered a no-contest plea to first-degree murder, abduction, and concealing a dead body. A no-contest plea meant he was not formally admitting he committed the acts, while accepting that the evidence was sufficient to convict him, and it carried the same legal weight as a guilty plea. The judge found him guilty of all 3 charges. At his sentencing in June of 2018, the proceeding split into 2 irreconcilable portraits. Eisenhower's former teachers and a school friend testified that they had been stunned to learn he was involved in a murder, describing him as a gentle person who had been eager for acceptance. Experts testified that he had an autism spectrum disorder, and one suggested the condition had made him susceptible to being manipulated by Keepers. Eisenhower read a statement apologizing to Nicole's family, saying he was sorry for the pain his actions had caused, that it was his deepest regret, and that nothing could undo what had been done. On the other side of the room sat the family of a dead 13-year-old. Prosecutors asked for a life sentence. The judge handed down 75 years, with 25 of them suspended, leaving an active sentence of 50 years to be followed by 2 decades of probation. Under Virginia law, he will have to serve roughly 85% of that time, which works out to more than 4 decades behind bars before he can be released. Keepers stood trial separately later that year. Prosecutors argued she had been closely involved in helping plan the killing, while her attorneys told the jury she had believed the talk of murder was only a fantasy and had gone along with the discussions to hold on to her friendship with Eisenhower. The jury found her guilty of being an accessory before the fact. At her sentencing in November of 2018, she took the stand and apologized to Nicole's family, saying she had never intended for it to happen. She was sentenced to 45 years with 5 suspended, an active term of 40 years followed by probation. The grief that came out at the trials did not fit into the legal language around it. Nicole's mother testified about the morning she found the empty room, and she described, in her own words, a world that simply came tumbling down because Nicole had been her everything. When she was asked when she next saw her daughter after that night, she answered that the next time she saw Nicole was in the coffin. She has spoken about the cruelty of the math, that her daughter had been carried through a liver transplant and lymphoma and a coma and a drug-resistant infection, surviving every one of them, only to have her life taken by a person who had pretended to care about her. Nicole's father later spoke about the lasting psychological damage the loss had done to him. The 2 people who took Nicole away were a college engineering student and his friend, the kind of young people whose futures are usually described in the language of promise. And what they left behind was a family that buries a 13-year-old and a community that learned the hard way how an app on a phone can let a predator walk straight into a child's bedroom without ever crossing the threshold. What stays in the public record about Nicole Lovell is the smallness of the things she carried and the things she left. She took a phone and a cartoon blanket out the window with her because she believed she was going on a secret date and coming home. She left her medication on the nightstand because she had every intention of being there in the morning to take it. She was a 13-year-old who had survived more than most people survive in a lifetime, who wanted to sing, who still played in the snow with little kids, who went looking on her phone for someone who would finally make her feel wanted, and who found instead an 18-year-old who saw her not as a person, but as a secret that needed to disappear. Nicole Lovell was 13 years old. The blanket she carried out the window was found among the belongings of the people who killed her, and her mother, who had spent 13 years keeping her alive through one illness after another, was left to identify her in a coffin, a child, taken not by any of the diseases that had spent her whole life trying to take her, but by a boy she thought was her boyfriend. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Nicole Lovell trusted a voice on a screen and climbed out her own window to meet it, never knowing the voice had already decided she would not come back. The next case rewinds more than a decade, to a small Arkansas town in 2002, where a 13-year-old named Casey Woody fell for a boy she met in an online chat room, a boy who claimed to be 16 and lived nearby, and who was in fact a grown man more than 2,000 miles away with a plan. Section 5. Casey Woody. Her mother had done Hof and her father worked the overnight shift. Her dad was a police officer out on patrol. Her mother had died years before. Her two older brothers were not in the house. Casey was a 7th grader who had recently discovered boys, and over the previous months, she had found 2 of them in online chat rooms. 2 boys she talked to almost every day. One a real 14-year-old in Georgia, and one who called himself Dave and said he was 17 and lived in California. That night, a white van pulled up to the Woody home. By the time her brother came home and found her gone, with her shoes still sitting in the house and signs of a struggle near the door, Casey had already been taken. The boy named Dave was not a boy at all. He was a 47-year-old man who had flown across the country, rented a van and a storage unit near her home, and built a plan around a child who thought she had a crush. Casey Renee Woody was born on October 17, 1989, in Little Rock, Arkansas, and grew up in Holland, a small community in the central part of the state, with her father, Rick, and her 2 older brothers. Her mother, Christy, had been killed in a car accident roughly 6 years before, when Casey was still a little girl, and the loss shaped the household she grew up in. Her father was a patrol officer who worked nights, which meant that on some evenings Casey was home by herself, though various relatives kept an eye on her. By the autumn of 2002, she was a 7th grader at her middle school, and by every account, she was the kind of kid who made a room better. She was smart, taking advanced classes. She sang in the choir and played in the band. She had a loud, honking laugh that her best friends said was impossible to hear without laughing yourself. The kind of laugh that could pull a person out of the worst mood. Weeks before her death, she was crowned the 7th grade queen at her school's fall festival, and she wore her first grown-up dress, a long, shimmering black one with a shy smile. She had been wishing, around that time, for it to snow. Like a lot of 13-year-olds at the dawn of widespread home internet, Casey had started spending time in online chat rooms, and like a lot of 13-year-olds, she wanted a boyfriend. During the summer and fall of 2002, she formed close online bonds with 2 boys she had met that way. One was named Scott, a 14-year-old from Georgia who was exactly who he said he was. The other called himself Dave, sometimes Dave Fagan, and claimed to be a 17-year-old from the San Diego area. They had met in a chat room set up for Christian teenagers. Casey's father knew she was online talking to boys, and he made a calculation that millions of parents in those early internet years made. She was home, she was safe inside the house, and the boys were somewhere far away on a screen. The danger most parents pictured was a stranger at the front door. The danger that was actually forming was coming through the telephone line, and it had her home address. The person behind the name Dave was David Leslie Fuller, a 47-year-old man from California. His background was a slow accumulation of failures and resentments. He had grown up in an upper-middle-class household and had pushed back against his family's expectations, dropping out of school and spending years playing guitar in bars before enlisting in the Navy in his 30s. By 2002, his marriage was falling apart. His wife had complained about how much time he spent on the internet and had urged him to get help for his anger. Earlier that year, she had called the police alleging abuse, and the charges were dropped for lack of evidence, and by the summer she had filed for divorce. He had been fired from a job selling used cars after he was caught using company computers to look at pornography. Into the wreckage of that life he poured an obsession with a child in Arkansas, and he was patient about it. The planning stretched back nearly 2 months. In mid-October of 2002, Fuller made a first trip to Arkansas, flying into Little Rock, renting a car, and checking into a motel in Conway, the town next to Holland. Investigators believe he used that trip to watch Casey and her home. It was the same weekend she was crowned queen at the fall festival, the same weekend she wore that first grown-up dress, and she had no idea that the man she thought was a teenage boy in California was a few miles away, studying her. In the weeks that followed, he prepared the pieces of his plan in the area near her home, renting a van and a storage unit and securing a place to stay, telling people a cover story about being a young man who had come to visit a dying aunt. He had chloroform, he had a gun. On the night of December 3, with Casey's father on patrol and the house otherwise empty, Fuller arrived in his white van and took her. The home told the story of what had happened. There were signs of forced entry and a struggle near the door, and Casey's shoes were left behind in the house, the clear evidence that she had not walked out willingly with anyone. Based on the amount of chloroform later found in her body, investigators came to believe that from the moment Fuller seized her until the moment she died, Casey never regained consciousness, a grim detail that the people working the case would later describe as the only mercy in the entire crime. She was taken to the storage unit Fuller had rented in Conway, where he kept her bound in the back of the van. He sexually assaulted her. The 13-year-old, who had wanted nothing more complicated than a boyfriend, was now a captive of a grown man who had spent 2 months making it possible. The search that began that night moved with a speed that, even in the end, could not outrun him. When Casey's brother came home and found her gone, the family reported her missing, and the people who loved her began handing the police the thread that would lead to Fuller. Casey's best friends knew about the boy named Dave from the chat room. They told investigators about him, frightened, certain even then that Dave was the one who had taken her. The real 14-year-old, Scott in Georgia, helped as well, because he had been part of the same online circle and had information about the accounts. Investigators traced telephone calls that had been placed from Fuller's number to Casey's house, and they followed his credit card activity to the storage unit he had rented in Conway. Piece by piece, in a matter of roughly a day, a small Arkansas police department and the agencies helping it identified a 47-year-old man in California and located the unit where he had taken her. Law enforcement closed in on the storage facility on the evening of December 4, roughly 19 hours after Casey had been abducted. They had hoped to find her alive. As the officers approached the unit, a single gunshot sounded from inside. Fuller had shot himself rather than be taken. When officers entered, they found Casey in the back of the minivan inside the storage unit. She had been bound, she had been sexually assaulted, and she had been shot in the head. One of the officers who opened the back of that van and saw her would later say the scene came back to him every night he put his own daughter to bed. Casey Woody was 13 years old, and she had been killed by a man she believed was a teenage boy who liked her. Because Fuller took his own life as police arrived, there was no trial, no jury, no sentencing, none of the long legal process that usually follows a murder. What there was instead was the contents of his life laid open by investigators after the fact. And what they found made clear that Casey had not been a one-time fixation. In Fuller's California apartment, the FBI found names, photographs, phone numbers, and addresses belonging to children in Arkansas and to girls across the country. other young people who had also believed that the boy on the screen was a cute teenager who understood them. Among all of it, one item stood out: a framed collage of photographs of Casey, marking her as his favorite. The case became, for law enforcement across the United States, a turning point. It is often described as the first well-documented murder committed by an online predator in the country. The case that forced police agencies to understand that the chat room was a new kind of front door, and that the wolf could now study a child for months from 2,000 miles away before ever leaving home. The grief in Holland arrived with the weather. Casey had been wishing for snow for weeks, and according to her best friends, it began to snow at the very moment they learned she was gone. A small, unbearable coincidence that the people who loved her have carried ever since. Her friends had spent the day she was missing holding on to the belief that she was going to come home, and the snow was how they knew she would not. Casey was buried in a small Arkansas cemetery. In the years that followed, her family and community built a foundation in her name, dedicated to teaching children and parents about the dangers that live in online spaces, the exact danger that no one in 2002 had a name for yet. Her friends have continued, decades later, to tell her story to new audiences, including national television, with a single stated purpose: that her death not be in vain, and that another child be spared. They have described her the way friends describe the people they have lost too early, talking about her honking laugh and her kindness, and their certainty that, had she lived, she would have done something great. What stays in the public record about Casey Woody is the way an ordinary, hopeful 13-year-old want was turned into a weapon against her. She wanted a boyfriend. She found 2 boys online, and one of them was real, and one of them was a 47-year-old man who had learned exactly what to say to a lonely, motherless girl who sometimes spent her evenings home alone. He won her trust through a screen, gathered her phone number and her address out of friendly conversation, and then flew across the country twice, the second time with chloroform and a gun and a rented storage unit, to do what he had been planning for 2 months. Casey Woody was 13 years old, a 7th grade queen in a borrowed grown-up dress, a girl who wished for snow. The snow came the day she died, and the officer who found her carried the image of it to his own daughter's bedside for years. And the case that ended in a storage unit in Conway is the reason a generation of parents finally understood that the person their child was falling for on the other side of the screen might be no one they could ever have imagined. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Casey Woody fell for a boy who lived only on a screen, and the man behind him had been studying her for months before he ever knocked. The next case crosses the ocean to South Australia, where a 15-year-old named Carly Ryan spent more than a year falling in love with a sweet, artistic boy online, a boy who sent her music and poetry, and who never existed at all. Section 6. Carly Ryan. On the morning of February 20th, 2007, the body of a 15-year-old girl named Carly Ryan was found in the shallow water at a beach called Port Elliot, on the coast south of Adelaide in South Australia. She had turned 15 only weeks before. She lived in the Adelaide Hills town of Stirling with her mother, who was also her closest confidant. For more than a year she had been in love, or believed she was, with a boy she had met online, a handsome 18-year-old musician from Melbourne named Brandon Kane, who sent her messages and talked to her on the phone and seemed to understand her in the way teenagers long to be understood. Brandon was not real. He was the invention of a man in his late 40s, a serial predator who had built the boy out of nothing and used him for more than 18 months to win the love of a child, and who, when Carly was no longer useful to him alive, lured her to a dark beach and killed her. Carly Ryan would come to be described as the first person in Australia murdered by an online predator, and the law that bears her name exists because her mother refused to let her death mean nothing. Carly Ryan was born on January 31st, 1992, and grew up in Stirling, a green town in the hills outside Adelaide, with her mother, Sonia. By every account, the bond between them was unusually close. As Carly moved into her teenage years, Sonia became a confidant, a keeper of secrets, the parent a daughter actually talks to. Carly was a bright, pretty, creative teenager, the kind of girl with a wide circle and an open heart. When she met a boy online whom she connected with, a musician named Brandon Kane, She did not hide it from her mother. She told Sonia how much she liked him. Sonia, doing what a careful parent in the mid-2000s would do, sometimes looked over her daughter's shoulder while Carly chatted at the computer, and she never saw anything that alarmed her. The boy seemed sweet. He shared Carly's interests in music and art. He said the right things. Over many months, through messages and phone calls, Carly came to believe she was in love, and by the time the two of them were talking about meeting in person, that belief had become the center of her world. The truth behind Brandon Kane was a man named Gary Francis Newman, a Victorian man whom different accounts have placed at between 48 and 50 years old at the time, an overweight, balding information technology worker and a pedophile. Brandon was not his only mask. When police eventually examined his life, they found that he had operated something on the order of 200 different online identities, an entire population of invented people built for a single purpose: to make children believe they had found a friend or a sweetheart. Brandon Kane was simply the persona he had aimed at Carly. He had spent more than 18 months inhabiting that character, sending the music and the affection and the patient attention that a teenage girl would not think to doubt. He was, by the accounts of those who later studied the case, supremely convincing, so convincing that the deception held up even when he stepped out from behind the screen. The fracture came around Carly's 15th birthday, at the start of 2007. Newman travelled from Victoria to Carly's home in the Adelaide Hills, but he did not arrive as Brandon. He arrived posing as Brandon's father, a man he called Shane, bearing gifts and greetings from his son. The family welcomed him with open arms because to them he was the kind, slightly older relative of the lovely boy their Carly adored. Behind that mask, Newman made advances toward Carly himself, and she rejected him. When her mother realized what was happening in her own house, she removed Newman from it. The rejection enraged him. He returned to Melbourne carrying not embarrassment but a grudge, and he resolved to get back at the 15-year-old who had turned him down. The tool he reached for was the same one he had used to get close to her in the first place. He went back to being Brandon. What followed in February of 2007 was the cruelest possible use of everything he had built. Speaking again as Brandon, the boy Carly loved, Newman convinced her to come and meet him one final time. The invitation came from the persona she trusted completely, the voice that had been with her for a year and a half, and she went to it the way she would have gone to any boy she believed loved her back. Newman took her to a secluded stretch of beach at Port Elliot. There, on the dark sand, he assaulted her, suffocated her, and threw her into the water to drown. She was 15 years old. Newman did not act entirely alone that night. His teenage son was present and witnessed the killing and would later be cleared of any charges and have his identity permanently suppressed. Carly's dreams and her future were taken from her on a beach by a man who had spent 18 months pretending to be the future she was reaching toward. The discovery came the next morning when Carly's body was found in the shallow water at Port Elliot. A homicide investigation began immediately, and from the start, it turned toward the place where the danger had actually lived, which was Carly's computer. Investigators examined her online accounts and found the long, regular contact with the user calling himself Brandon Kane, the 18-year-old musician she had believed was her boyfriend. Working with the social networking platform where the contact had occurred, and with internet service providers, police traced the Brandon Kane profile back through its digital trail to Gary Francis Newman in Victoria. 11 days after Carly's body was found, police raided his home. When they came through the door, they found him at his computer, logged in as Brandon Kane, in the middle of chatting with another 14-year-old girl, this one in Western Australia. The persona that had killed Carly was, at that very moment, being aimed at the next child. Newman was arrested and charged with her murder, and the discovery of his roughly 200 online identities made plain that Carly had not been a single obsession but one target among many. The trial ran for more than 3 months, from October of 2009 into the following year, in the Supreme Court of South Australia. Newman behaved erratically throughout, and he initially denied even having met the teenager he had spent years grooming. The jury did not accept it. He was found guilty of murder. On March 31, 2010, the court sentenced Gary Francis Newman to life imprisonment with a non-parole period of 29 years, which means he must serve at least that long before he can even be considered for release. The man who built 200 fake people to hunt children was finally reduced to a single real one, a convicted murderer with a fixed cell and a number, while the girl he had constructed Brandon Kane to capture was buried at 15. The aftermath belonged, more than anything, to Carly's mother. Sonia Ryan had lost the child who had been her reason for living, and in the first shock of it, she felt that her own life was over. What she did with the years that followed turned a private catastrophe into a national mission. In 2010, she helped establish the Carly Ryan Foundation, a charity dedicated to internet safety, which built education programs delivered to students and parents across Australia, teaching young people and the adults around them how grooming actually works and what the warning signs look like. Sonia became one of the most recognized voices in the country on the subject of protecting children online, and she campaigned for a decade for a change in the law that the case had exposed as missing. The problem the case had revealed was simple and terrible. Under the law as it stood when Carly died, police often could not act against an online predator until after the predator had actually done something physical, by which point, for Carly, it had been far too late. That campaign produced Carly's Law. After 10 years of advocacy by Sonia Ryan and the Foundation, federal legislation bearing Carly's name was passed by the Australian Parliament in 2017, introduced by an independent member of Parliament named Rebecca Sharkey, and it received royal assent later that year. The law created a federal offence targeting adults who use deceptive online communications, including lying about their age, to prepare or plan to harm a child, allowing law enforcement to step in earlier before a predator could reach the stage Newman had reached on that beach. Within months of the law taking effect, it was used for the first time against a convicted sex offender accused of posing as a young woman online to groom children. A patchwork quilt made in Carly's name was hung in Parliament to mark the long wait for the protections the case had demanded. Sonia Ryan was recognised nationally for her work, an ordinary mother who had become a leader in a fight she never asked to join. What stays in the public record about Carly Ryan is the length and the patience of the deception that killed her. This was not a stranger who grabbed a child off a street. This was a man who spent more than 18 months becoming, in every detail, the boy a teenage girl would fall in love with, who sent the music and the messages and the affection, who built trust slowly and deliberately, who got himself welcomed into the family home by playing the part of the boyfriend's father, and who, when the child rejected the real man behind the mask, used the mask one last time to call her to a beach. Carly Ryan was 15 years old. She believed she was going to meet the boy she loved. The boy had never existed for a single day. Her mother has said that the love between the two of them is what sparked a national campaign to protect other children, and the law that now lets Australian police move against predators before they strike carries the name of a girl who trusted a voice that had been lying to her since she was 13, and who walked to a dark beach to meet it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Carly Ryan was destroyed by a love that had been manufactured to destroy her, an invented boyfriend wielded by a predator with 200 faces. The next case moves back to small-town America and back in time to 1992, to a 12-year-old named Shanda Sharer, whose only mistake was being cared for by a girl that someone else believed she had no right to, and whose murder was carried out not by a grown predator, but by a group of teenagers her own age. Section 7. Shanda Sharer. On the night of January 10, 1992, 12-year-old Shanda Sharer was staying at her father's home in southern Indiana when two teenage girls knocked on the door and told her that an older girl she cared about was waiting outside to see her. Shanda was in 6th grade. She had moved to the New Albany area not long before, the kind of bright, social 12-year-old who makes friends quickly and feels things deeply. She loved the girl the visitors said was waiting for her, and so, a little after midnight, she got into a car with strangers to go meet her. She had no way of knowing that the girl she was being taken to see was not there at all, that another teenager was crouched under a blanket in the back seat with a knife, and that the entire visit had been arranged for one purpose: to punish a 12-year-old for being loved by someone a jealous rival believed belonged to her. By the next morning, Shanda Sharer would be dead in a field near Madison, Indiana, killed not by a grown predator, but by 4 girls aged 15 to 17, in a case that horrified the country precisely because of who had carried it out. Shanda Renee Sharer was born on June 6, 1979, and her family had moved to New Albany, Indiana, in 1991, after earlier years in Kentucky. She was, by the accounts of the people who knew her, a sweet and outgoing child, pretty and warm, and quick to attach to people. At her school, she met an older girl named Amanda Hevrin, and the friendship between them deepened into something romantic, an exchange of notes and a visible closeness that drew attention from the other students. For a 12-year-old, it was a first real attachment, the ordinary and clumsy beginning of figuring out who you are and who you want to be near. Shanda's parents grew uncomfortable with how much time she was spending around older kids, and after they discovered the nature of her relationship with Amanda, they transferred her to a Catholic school in late November of 1991, hoping to steer her back toward her own age group. To Shanda, it was a first love and a source of trouble at home. To someone else, it was a provocation. That someone was Melinda Loveless, who was 16. Loveless had been in a turbulent on-and-off relationship with Amanda Hevrin, going back to around 1990. And when Shanda arrived and grew close to Amanda, Loveless's jealousy curdled into something far past ordinary teenage possessiveness. She confronted Shanda at a school dance in the fall of 1991, where the two got into a physical altercation. In the weeks that followed, she made public threats. She wrote letters expressing that she wanted Shanda dead. She spoke openly, to other people, about killing a 12-year-old over a girl. Loveless's own home life had been a nightmare of abuse, a fact that would later surface in court and that her defense would raise as context, and the rage she carried out of it found a target in a child who had done nothing but be cared for by the person Loveless wanted. The plan took shape when Loveless befriended a 17-year-old named Lori Tackett, and the two of them reinforced each other's worst impulses. Tackett brought in 2 more girls, 15-year-olds Hope Rippey and Toni Lawrence. On January 10, 1992, the 3 of them drove from Madison to New Albany to collect Loveless, and Loveless made clear what the night was supposed to be. The lure was built entirely around Shanda's feelings for Amanda. Lawrence and Rippey went to the door of Shanda's father's home first, introduced themselves as friends of Amanda's, and said Amanda was waiting in the car and wanted to talk. Shanda told them she could not come out yet and asked them to come back after midnight. The girls left, went to a punk rock show by a local band, and returned around 12:30. This time Tackett and Rippey knocked, and Shanda, believing she was about to see the girl she loved, agreed to come with them. They told her Amanda was waiting at a local ruin overlooking the Ohio River, a spot known as the Witch's Castle. Shanda got into the car. Loveless was hidden in the back seat under a blanket. What happened over the next several hours is documented in detail in the court record, and it is the kind of detail that does not need to be recited in full to be understood. Shortly after Shanda was in the car, the questioning about Amanda began, and Loveless emerged from under the blanket and put a knife to the 12-year-old's throat to terrify her. The group took her to the abandoned property they had named as the meeting place, where, according to the later findings of the Indiana Supreme Court, they teased and frightened her, but left her essentially unharmed. The violence escalated afterward, at Tackett's house, and then in a series of moves across the dark countryside, as the night turned from cruelty into something far worse. Shanda was confined, beaten, and bound, and she was forced into the trunk of the car. At one point, the group believed she had already died. When they realized she was still alive, the violence resumed. In the early hours of January 11, 1992, in a remote area near Madison, Shanda Sharer was doused with gasoline and set on fire. And that is how a 12-year-old's life ended, at the hands of 4 other girls, over a relationship with a classmate. The case broke open almost immediately, and it broke open because the youngest layer of conscience in the group could not hold. One of the participants, overwhelmed by what she had been part of, went to the police with her parents and gave a statement that pointed directly at the others. That decision collapsed the timeline that the killers might otherwise have bought themselves. Shanda's body was found that same morning. By January 12, the day after the murder, Lovelace and Tackett were under arrest, and the full group of 4 was identified. Investigators who might have spent weeks or months piecing the crime together instead had it laid out for them within roughly a day, because a 15-year-old could not live with the silence. All 4 were charged as adults, an unusual and weighty decision for defendants so young, and it set up the possibility of the most serious penalties the state could impose. To avoid the risk of a death sentence, each of them accepted a plea bargain. Lovelace and Tackett pleaded guilty to murder, criminal confinement, and arson, and each was sentenced to 60 years in prison. Hope Rippey pleaded guilty to the same charges and was initially sentenced to 60 years, a term that was later reduced on appeal in 2004 to 35 years. Tony Lawrence, who had been the one whose conscience cracked, pleaded guilty to criminal confinement and received a maximum of 20 years. During Lovelace's sentencing, the long history of abuse in her own home came to light, and in the year that followed, her father was charged with serious sexual offences, a backdrop that explained nothing away but that the court was asked to weigh. The proceedings drew national attention not only because of the brutality but because the defendants were children, and the country struggled with the question of what justice even looks like when the people who tortured a 12-year-old to death are teenagers themselves. The contrast at the centre of the case has only sharpened with time, because all 4 of the people who killed Shanda Sharer have since walked out of prison. Tony Lawrence was released first, after roughly 9 years. Hope Rippey was released after about 14. Laurie Tackett was released in January of 2018, after about 25 years, on the very anniversary of the night the crime began. Melinda Lovelace, the one whose jealousy had set everything in motion, was released in September of 2019, after more than 26 years, the last of the 4 to leave custody, and went on to serve her parole in Kentucky. Every person who participated in the murder of a 12-year-old eventually returned to the world. The 12-year-old did not. The grief radiating out from the case did not stay contained to the night of the crime. Shanda's father, Steve Sharer, never recovered from the loss of his daughter. He found his only escape in drinking, and he died of alcohol-related causes in 2005, at the age of 53. One more life the murder eventually took. The case became one of the most written about crimes in the state's history, a touchstone in arguments about juveniles, about jealousy, about how children can be capable of things adults can barely process. Shanda herself, in much of that coverage, risked becoming a footnote to the people who killed her, a name attached to a famous atrocity rather than a person, and the people who loved her have had to fight, the way the families in so many of these cases have to fight, simply to keep her remembered as a child rather than as a crime scene. What stays in the public record about Shanda Sharer is how small and ordinary the thing was that got her killed. She was 12. She had moved to a new town, started at a new school, and grown close to an older girl, the kind of first attachment that is supposed to be the most harmless part of growing up. That attachment, and nothing more, marked her as a rival in the eyes of a 16-year-old who could not stand to share, and the 16-year-old gathered 3 others and built a lie out of Shanda's own feelings to draw her out of her father's house after midnight. The bait was the promise of seeing the girl she loved. Shanda Sharer was 12 years old, killed by 4 teenagers in a field in Indiana over a schoolyard romance, and the 4 people who did it have all since been released, while she remains exactly where the night of January 11, 1992 left her, a 6th grader who got into a car because she believed someone she loved was waiting at the other end of the drive. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Shanda Sharer was killed not by the person she loved, but by someone who could not bear that she was loved at all, lured to her death by the promise of seeing a sweetheart who was never there. The next case returns to the more familiar shape of these stories, a relationship that simply ended as a 17-year-old in Washington state named Jessica Schaw broke up with her boyfriend after 2 years and discovered, a week later, that for him the end of the relationship was something he could not allow her to survive. Section 8. Jessica Schaw. On the morning of Friday, May 25, 2012, 17-year-old Jessica Schaw was getting ready for a school day in her family's 2-story home on Southeast 164th Street in Renton, Washington, around the corner from the high school where she was a junior. She was an aspiring designer with an eye for color and a love of theater, known to her friends simply as Jess. the kind of teenager people described with the same few words over and over, a beautiful smile and a caring nature. That morning, before the school day began, Lane came to the house. A neighbor across the street, stepping outside for a smoke, heard the two of them in a serious argument around 20 minutes to 7. By the time firefighters arrived to put out a fire at the home a short while later, Jessica was dead on the second floor, and the boy she had broken up with was already driving east, putting 2,000 miles between himself and what he had done. Jessica Schaw was born on December 28, 1994, and she grew up in the Renton area as the only child of Douglas and Stephanie Sumida Schaw, surrounded by a large extended family spread across the western states. By the spring of 2012, she was a junior at Lindbergh High School, a school whose motto points to the stars. The people who knew her remembered a girl with a passion for design and color and a love of theater, someone friends would later call comforting but also unyielding, a person with a firm sense of herself behind the warmth. She had taken a child development class where students care for an electronic infant, and a classmate would later recall the way she carried that assignment with a smile, taking on the challenge the way she took on most things. She was, by every account that surfaced after her death, well-liked, kind, and quick to be there for the people around her. She was 17, finishing her junior year, with her senior year and everything after it still ahead of her. For about 2 years, Jessica had dated Jarrod Lane. He had graduated from the same high school in 2011, a year ahead of her, and during their relationship he had become a familiar presence in the Schaw household, the boyfriend the parents knew and let into their home. By the standards of teenage relationships, it had been a long and serious one. Then Jessica ended it. Accounts of the timing vary slightly, with some placing the breakup about a week before her death and others about 2 weeks, and the records agree on the essential point that she had broken it off, and that Lane could not accept it. Friends and authorities later said he had taken the breakup very badly and had seemed distraught in the days that followed. He wanted her back. Even on the day he killed her, a message remained on his social media page, describing how he had fallen for a girl named Jessica Schaw and wanted to be with her for the rest of his life. A public profession of love posted by the same person who would end her life that morning. The fracture between what Lane felt and what was actually true narrowed down to a single early morning visit. On the morning of May 25, Lane went to Jessica's home because he knew she would be there and, by his own later account, to his mother, because he wanted to talk to her and try to win her back. It was a school morning. Jessica was getting ready. The neighbor across the street heard the serious argument carry out of the house around 6:40 in the morning. According to what Lane told his mother afterward, Jessica told him during that conversation that she was seeing someone else, and at that, he said, he snapped. What followed was not a single blow struck in a flash of rage. It was a sustained and savage attack on a 17-year-old girl in her own home. Lane stabbed Jessica repeatedly with kitchen knives, with such force that the blades broke. He beat her. The county medical examiner would later determine that she died of a combination of multiple stab wounds, blunt force injuries, and signs consistent with strangulation. Her mother, who would speak about it later in court, said that Jessica had been tortured for a long stretch of time, that the boy who had been welcomed into their family had shown her daughter no sympathy and no compassion. The full sequence the prosecution laid out at sentencing was harrowing enough that it left the courtroom in tears, and the gravity of it does not require repeating in detail. What matters is the duration and the deliberateness. The fact that this was a prolonged killing carried out by someone who had spent 2 years being loved by the person he was attacking. After Jessica was dead, Lane tried to erase what he had done. He set fire to a couch on the second floor of the house, an act of arson meant to cover the crime, and then he fled. He got into his car and drove, putting roughly 2,000 miles between himself and Renton, heading toward Oklahoma. He left behind a burning home and a family that was about to be destroyed. The discovery came through the fire he set. Firefighters responded to the blaze at the Schaw home and, after knocking down the flames, found the couch on the second floor burning and Jessica on the floor nearby, unconscious. Their attempts to revive her were unsuccessful. No one else was in the house. Investigators quickly recognized that the injuries on her body were not consistent with a fire death, and the medical examiner ruled her death a homicide. Renton police gathered evidence at the scene, and the focus turned immediately toward the ex-boyfriend who had been distraught over the breakup and who was now nowhere to be found. Lane's flight ended on the side of a highway in Oklahoma. Several days after the murder, his vehicle ran out of gas and was left abandoned on the shoulder of an interstate roughly 18 miles north of Oklahoma City. As it happened, a news crew was in the area, and Lane was spotted and recognized, in some accounts walking along the side of the road, with witnesses connecting him to the photograph that had been circulating. The police were called. Oklahoma officers and state troopers took him into custody. He did not resist, and he acknowledged to the officers that he was wanted in connection with a homicide in Washington. In conversations with his own mother, recounted in the charging documents, Lane admitted what he had done. He told her he had gone to Jessica's home that morning to talk, that Jessica had told him she was seeing someone else, and that he had snapped, and when his mother pressed him, asking directly whether he had killed Jessica, he said that he had. He was held in an Oklahoma jail on $2 million bail and waived extradition so he could be returned to Washington to face the charges. Lane was charged in King County with first-degree murder, carrying 2 deadly weapon enhancements, and with first-degree arson. The case did not go to a full trial. In the autumn of 2013, Lane pleaded guilty to both charges. His sentencing took place in October of 2013, in King County Superior Court before Judge Mary Yu, and so many of Jessica's relatives, friends, and schoolmates filled the courtroom that additional benches had to be brought in. The proceeding became a confrontation between a family's grief and a young man's belated remorse. Jessica's mother stood and spoke about the daughter she had seen alive only hours before her death, about the impossibility of believing she could be gone, and she said plainly that there was no future left that had her daughter in it. Jessica's father objected bitterly to any discussion of rehabilitating Lane, asking what right Lane had to rehabilitation when his daughter had been given no right to anything at all. Lane, standing in his orange jail uniform with his eyes closed for much of it, spoke as well. He told the court he took full responsibility, that he had never planned the murder, and he apologized to the parents who had welcomed him into their home and whose only child he had killed, saying he could not express how sorry he was for his selfish acts on a day he called unthinkable and unforgettable. Judge Yu sentenced him to 33 years in prison, the maximum the law allowed for the crimes and the enhancements. The grief in Renton had begun long before the sentencing. In the days after Jessica's death, hundreds of people attended a candlelight vigil. A memorial of flowers, drawings, photographs, and balloons grew across the front of her house, and former classmates traveled back to sit on the lawn and try to understand what had happened to a girl they knew. A public memorial service was held in the auditorium of her own high school, where more than 750 family members, friends, teachers, classmates, and first responders gathered, and the minister opened by invoking the school's motto and its eagle, saying they were there to celebrate the life of an eagle who had already ascended to the stars. Her family established a memorial fund in her name, directing a portion of it to programs in Renton that work against domestic and teen dating violence, turning the loss of one girl toward the protection of others. What stays in the public record about Jessica Schaw is the speed with which an ordinary ending became an unsurvivable one. She did the thing that teenagers do and are supposed to be able to do safely. After 2 years, she decided the relationship was over, and she ended it. A week or so later, on a normal school morning, the boy she had broken up with came to the home he had been welcomed into so many times, wanting to talk her out of it. When she told him she had moved on and was seeing someone else, he did not leave, and he did not accept it. He killed her over the course of a prolonged and brutal attack, set her family's home on fire to hide it, and drove 2,000 miles before a stalled car on an Oklahoma highway brought it all to a stop. Jessica Schaw was 17 years old, an aspiring designer with a love of theatre and a smile everyone remembered, the only child of parents who had welcomed her killer into their family. She had simply ended a relationship the way she had every right to, and a boy who could not bear to be left turned her own house into the place she died. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Jessica Schaw was killed for the unforgivable act of moving on by a boy who would rather destroy her than let her go. The next case moves to the open country of the Northern Plains, where a 16-year-old named Shaina Riffola met a boy online, fell hard enough to leave her whole life behind, and ran away across state lines to be with him, only to be dead within a week of walking out her door. Section 9. Shaina Riffola. On October 3, 2019, 16-year-old Shaina Riffola walked into a coffee shop in the small town of Moorcroft, in the open ranch country of northeastern Wyoming, and got into a vehicle with a boy she had never met in person. She lived on her family's ranch south of the nearby town of Upton, raised by her grandparents and her mother in a house full of people who had loved her since before she was born. For weeks, she had been talking to a 17-year-old named Michael Campbell, a boy from across the state line in South Dakota, whom she had met on an online dating site, and the two of them had made a plan. He would drive to Wyoming, pick her up, and she would run away from her life on the ranch to go live with him. She got into the vehicle at that coffee shop and rode roughly an hour across the border to his home near Sturgis, South Dakota. Within a day, she was dead in the basement of that house, shot once in the head during an argument, and her body would not be found for several more days, leaving her family on the ranch to wait through the worst kind of silence. Shaina Lynn Riffola was born on July 6, 2003, in Gillette, Wyoming. The obituary her family later wrote contains a detail that says almost everything about how wanted she was. Before she was even born, the sound of her heartbeat coming through a baby monitor filled the hospital room, and that sound, the family wrote, made them fall hopelessly in love with her before she had taken her first breath. She went home from the hospital to her grandparents' house on the Riffola Ranch south of Upton, where she grew up with her mother and her sisters. She was a ranch kid in a remote corner of the country, in a community small enough that everyone knows everyone. From a very young age, she loved the telephone, and she would spend hours on the line with her great-grandfather, often hiding in a closet or under a table with the phone pressed to her ear, asking him to guess where she was while he played along from the other end. There is one more thing the family wrote about Shaina, and it is the saddest and most important detail in understanding what happened to her. They said that what heaven would finally give her was the knowledge that she had been deeply loved here on earth, because that was something she had never been able to believe while she was alive. She struggled, they wrote, to accept that she was loved, no matter how many people around her loved her. A 16-year-old who could not believe she was loved is a 16-year-old who is uniquely vulnerable to the first voice that tells her, convincingly and constantly, that she is. That voice came through a screen. The boy on the other end of it was Michael Gavin Campbell, a 17-year-old who lived east of Sturgis, South Dakota, in a home he shared with his mother, near the Wyoming border. He and Shaina met on an online chat and dating website, and over a period of weeks an online relationship formed, the kind that can feel enormous to a teenager who is lonely and longing to be wanted. They referred to it as a relationship. He was, in the language used around the case afterward, her long-distance boyfriend, a sweetheart she had never been in the same room with. As the weeks went on, the two of them made a plan that went far beyond messaging. Campbell would drive across the state line to Wyoming, collect Shaina, and bring her back to live with him at his house, and she would leave her family and her life on the ranch behind. For a girl who could not believe she was loved, the offer of a whole new life with someone who claimed to love her was the most powerful pull imaginable. The plan narrowed to a single afternoon. On October 3, 2019, Campbell drove from South Dakota into Wyoming, and Shaina met him at a coffee shop in Moorcroft, a town a few hours from the state capital, where she was seen getting into the vehicle he had driven over. It was, by the accounts that emerged later, the first time the two of them had ever been together in person. He drove her roughly an hour back across the border to the home he shared with his mother near Sturgis. Whatever Shaina had imagined the new life would be, what she had actually done was leave behind everyone who loved her to go into a house she had never seen, with a boy she had only ever known through a screen, in a state where no one was expecting her. What happened inside that house is, by the design of the people who prosecuted the case, not fully known to the public, because a judge sealed the case affidavit days after the arrest at the prosecutor's request, citing the sensitive nature of the case and the publicity around it. What is established in the record is the outcome. At the home, with Campbell's mother not present, The two teenagers got into an argument. The prosecutor would later say in court that it is not clear what sparked the argument or how it escalated. What is clear is that it ended when Campbell took a handgun belonging to his mother and shot Shaina once in the head. She was 16 years old and she had been in South Dakota for less than a day, and the boy she had run away to be with killed her in the basement of his house. When a judge later asked Campbell directly whether he had any justification for what he had done, he answered that he did not. The discovery came slowly, through the machinery of a missing person case that crossed 2 states. Shaina had been reported missing after she was last seen getting into that vehicle at the coffee shop, and Wyoming authorities worked with their counterparts in South Dakota to find her. On October 6th, investigators located Campbell's car and questioned him. The next day, October 7, agents from the South Dakota Division of Criminal Investigation and local deputies executed a search warrant at the home he shared with his mother, acting on a request that had come up through the cooperating sheriff's office, and they found Shaina's body in the basement bedroom. Campbell was arrested immediately. Back in Wyoming, Shaina's 9-year-old sister Jocelyn had ridden the school bus that fall and seen police cars heading toward the family ranch, and had sat in her 3rd-grade classroom wondering whether they had found her big sister. She was pulled out of class and met by her grandmother, who was crying, and at first the little girl thought they were happy tears, and then understood that they were not. That was how the youngest member of the family learned that Shaina, missing for days, had been found shot to death in a basement across the state line. Because Campbell was 17, the case moved through the system with the particular complications that come with a juvenile defendant accused of killing someone. He was charged as an adult and indicted on alternate counts of 1st-degree and 2nd-degree murder. At his arraignment, he pleaded not guilty, and also not guilty by reason of insanity. He was held on a $1 million bond at the juvenile facility in Rapid City. His defense attorney indicated that the shooting had not been planned and that alcohol and drugs had been involved, and raised the possibility that his client suffered from post-traumatic stress. In May of 2020, Campbell changed his plea as part of an agreement with prosecutors. He pleaded guilty to 1st-degree manslaughter, a charge that in South Dakota reflects a killing committed without the specific intent to cause death, and in exchange, the murder charges were dismissed. During the change of plea hearing, he described what he had done in flat, plain language, saying that the two of them had gotten into an argument and that he had shot her in the head, and he referred to Shaina as his girlfriend as he said it. The sentencing took place in July of 2020 at the Meade County Court in Sturgis, before Judge Kevin Krull. Both the prosecution and the defense had jointly agreed to recommend a sentence of 55 years, and the judge accepted that recommendation. Because Campbell had been a juvenile at the time of the killing, he could not be sentenced to life in prison. Under the terms of the sentence, he could become eligible to seek parole after 27 years, when he would be around 44 years old, and the plea agreement required him to give up his right to appeal. He was held in the county jail until he turned 18, at which point he was transferred to prison to begin serving the sentence. Shaina's grandmother later said that she could only truly begin to mourn once she received the notification that he had been moved to prison, as though some part of her could not let go of the danger until the door had finally closed on him. The grief settled over a ranch family and a small Wyoming community that knew Shaina her whole life. Her funeral was held in the auditorium of the elementary school in Upton, with a private burial on the family ranch where she had grown up. The people of northeastern Wyoming and the nearby Black Hills did what small communities do, surrounding the family with prayers and flowers and food and letters, and offering tributes to Shaina at local athletic events. A regional utility company created a preschool scholarship in her memory, a small permanent thing in her name in the place she came from. Her grandparents praised the investigators, the attorneys, the judge, and the prosecutor who had handled the case, and they spoke openly about what the loss had done to them, the grandmother describing the physical sickness of it, and the grandfather echoing her, both of them caught in the disbelief that a granddaughter could simply be gone. What stays in the public record about Shaina Riffola is the cruel fit between what she needed and what she was offered. The family who loved her wrote, in the most painful sentence imaginable, that she had spent her life unable to believe she was loved, and that they hoped she finally understood it now. A girl who cannot believe she is wanted is exactly the kind of girl who will run toward the first person who tells her, every day on a screen, that she is wanted completely. Michael Campbell offered her that, an entire new life with someone who said he loved her, and she left the ranch and her mother and her little sisters and her great-grandfather on the telephone to go and claim it. She got into a vehicle at a coffee shop in Moorcroft, rode across the border to a house she had never seen, and was dead within a day, shot once in the head in a basement by the boy she had crossed a state line to be with. Shaina Riffola was 16 years old. She is buried on her family's ranch in the country she came from, and the obituary her family wrote holds the whole tragedy in a single line: that heaven for Shaina would finally be knowing she was loved, because on earth she never could. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Shaina Riffola ran toward a love she had never been able to believe in, and it killed her within a day of her leaving home. The final case crosses the equator to Argentina, where a 12-year-old named Michaela Ortega slipped away to meet a girl she had befriended online, a girl her own age who shared her love of a cartoon pony, and who turned out to be a grown man who had built the friendship for one purpose. Section 10. Michaela Ortega. In the early hours of April 23, 2016, in the city of Bahia Blanca, in the south of Buenos Aires province, Argentina, a 12-year-old girl named Michaela Ortega left a note for her family and slipped out of her house before the rest of the household was awake. Michaela, known to everyone as Mika, was going to meet a girl her own age, another 12-year-old she had been talking to on Facebook for about 4 months, a friend who liked the same things she did and understood her in the way that online friends at that age seem to. The friend did not exist. The account belonged to a 26-year-old man named Jonathan Luna, a fugitive who ran several fake profiles to befriend young girls, and the friendship he had spent 4 months building had a single purpose. Michaela walked out of her home that morning to meet a girl she trusted, and instead met the man who would take her to an empty field on the edge of the city and kill her. Her body would not be found for 35 days. Michaela Ortega was 12 years old, a girl from the Noroeste neighborhood of Bahia Blanca, the daughter of a mother named Monica Cid. She was, by everything that has been said about her, an ordinary, warm 12-year-old, the age where the social world is starting to widen and a new friend can feel like the most important thing in the world. Like many children her age in those years, part of her social life lived on Facebook. Over the course of about 4 months, she had built what she believed was a close friendship with another 12-year-old girl she had met there, a girl who presented herself as a fan of the football club River Plate and went by the handle La Roche de River. To Michaela, this was simply a friend, a peer, someone her own age whose parents, the friend claimed, let her go out and skip school in ways that made her seem a little older and a little freer. It was the kind of friendship a lonely or curious 12-year-old leans into. There was no reason in Michaela's world to imagine that the girl on the other end was not a girl at all. The person behind La Roche de River was Jonathan Luna, who was 26. He lived in a small house with few resources on the edge of Bahia Blanca, but he had a computer and access to Facebook, and he used that access to operate a set of false accounts, on the order of 4 of them, through which he contacted underage girls, posing as a female, befriending them and drawing them in. Michaela was one of the girls he targeted. He was also, at the time, a fugitive. He had been serving a sentence for aggravated robbery, had been granted a temporary release, and in December of 2014 had violated the terms of that release and fled, ending up in Bahia Blanca, where he spent his days building friendships with children he had never met, under names that were not his. The friendship with Michaela was, from his side, a long and patient piece of grooming, 4 months of becoming the girl she needed so that one day she would agree to come and meet him. That day was set for April 23. Having spent months as La Roche, Luna arranged the meeting, and he covered the gap between the girl Michaela expected and the man who would actually arrive with a simple lie delivered over chat. He told her that a cousin of her friend would come to pick her up and bring her to where the friend was waiting. To Michaela, the man who arrived was not a stranger, but the relative of someone she trusted completely. She left the note for her family, walked out before dawn, and met him. Municipal security cameras across the city captured what followed, and the footage is its own quiet horror. The cameras recorded Michaela and Luna meeting and then walking together for more than 9 kilometers across the city. A 12-year-old girl on foot beside a grown man, believing the entire time that she was being taken to her friend, the cousin walking her toward a reunion that was never going to happen. The walk ended at a hard-to-reach vacant lot on the outskirts of Bahia Blanca, a desolate place chosen precisely because no one would see and no one would hear. There, Luna attacked Michaela. He beat her, he attempted to sexually assault her, and when he could not do what he had brought her there to do, he strangled her. The court that later judged the case found that he had taken her to that field intending to commit a sexual crime, and, having failed in that intention, had killed her to conceal what he had done. By his own account afterward, he killed the 12-year-old because she would not give him what he wanted. She was 12 years old, and she died in an empty lot believing, until the end of the long walk that brought her there, that she was on her way to see a friend. The discovery took 35 days, and through every one of them, Michaela's mother and the city searched. After Michaela was reported missing, authorities mounted repeated searches and operations across Bahia Blanca, and every one of them came up empty. The note Michaela had left, pointing toward a friend's house in a nearby town, was part of a trail that had been laid by a man who did not exist. The breakthrough came from outside Argentina, a non-profit organization in the United States that works globally against the exploitation of children, the kind of organization that internet providers are legally required to notify when users upload child sexual abuse material, provided information that proved decisive. With that data, and with the security camera footage that had captured the long walk, investigators were able to establish that Michaela had been contacted through false Facebook profiles, and that the accounts traced back to Jonathan Luna. A search warrant was executed at his home, and inside it, police found Michaela's cell phone, her jacket, and a hair straightener that had belonged to her. Confronted, Luna confessed, and he led investigators to the place where he had hidden her body. Michaela Ortega was found on May 28, 2016, in a vacant lot on the outskirts of the city, 35 days after she had walked out her front door. When the news of the killing spread, enraged neighbors set upon Luna's house and partially burned it to the ground. The trial took place at a criminal court in Bahia Blanca, before a panel of 3 judges, and it laid bare that Michaela had not been Luna's only target. Other young girls who had also been contacted and drawn in by Luna through his fake profiles testified, describing the same pattern of a friendly girl their own age who turned out to be the same man. The prosecution and the family's lawyers both sought the maximum penalty. The defense tried to recast the killing as a homicide committed in the course of a robbery and asked for a sentence of 20 years and psychological treatment. On October 19, 2017, the court rejected that framing and convicted Jonathan Luna, sentencing him to life imprisonment. The conviction was for femicide, a homicide aggravated as an act of gender violence, committed with treachery, and in order to conceal another crime after he failed to achieve the sexual assault he had intended, together with the crimes of technological sexual harassment, the legal term for online grooming, and robbery. The case carried a particular grim distinction. It was the first case in Argentina in which grooming, the patient online manipulation of a child by an adult, had ended in the murder of the victim. Luna's defense appealed the life sentence through every available level of the Argentine court system, challenging the penalty again and again, and every appeal failed. In July of 2023, the Supreme Court of Argentina left the life sentence firmly in place. Years later, after Luna reportedly attempted to make contact with Michaela's own mother, a court barred him from accessing social networks at all, closing off the single tool that had made his crimes possible in the first place. Michaela's mother, Monica Sid, attended the proceedings and, when the verdict came down, spoke to her daughter rather than to the man who had killed her, telling Michaela to fly high. She has said, in the years since, that the family achieved an exemplary sentence and that there is no sentence and no verdict that can ever repair the loss of a child. Out of Michaela's death came a law that carries her name. The Michaela Ortega law, recorded in the Argentine legal code, was driven forward by her mother's advocacy and addresses the danger that killed her. It requires social networking platforms operating in Argentina to warn minors about the risks of those platforms, and it established a national program for the prevention of and education about the online harassment of children and adolescents. It is the kind of measure that exists only because a specific child died in a specific, preventable way, and because her mother refused to let that death pass without forcing the country to look at how it had happened. What stays in the public record about Michaela Ortega is the length of the lie and the smallness of the girl who believed it. She was 12. She made a friend on the internet, a girl her own age who liked the things she liked, and over 4 patient months that friendship became real enough to her that she would leave a note, slip out of her house before dawn, and walk across an entire city to meet it. The friend was a 26-year-old fugitive who had spent those 4 months becoming exactly the person a 12-year-old would trust, and who had run the same scheme on other girls before her. Michaela Ortega was 12 years old. She walked 9 kilometers beside the man who would kill her, certain the whole way that she was going to see her friend. And the law that now warns Argentine children about the dangers waiting behind a friendly profile carries the name of a girl who never got to learn that her friend had never existed. These 10 girls lived through 10 versions of the same betrayal. Some of them were killed by predators who had built an entire person out of nothing, a sweet boyfriend or a friendly girl assembled across months, specifically to draw a child out of her own front door. Some were killed by boys their own age who could not survive the word no, a declined prom invitation, a finished relationship, a new boyfriend mentioned in the wrong moment. One was killed by a jealous rival who could not stand that she was loved at all. What every one of them shares is the same small, ordinary human starting point, the wish to be liked, to be wanted, to be in love or close to it, the most normal feeling a young person can have. For each of them, that feeling was found by someone who turned it into a weapon. Their families were left to do the only thing left to do, which is to keep saying their names, to build the foundations and pass the laws and hold the vigils, and to insist, against an internet and a culture that too often remembers only how these girls died, that each of them was a whole person first. They were 12 and 13 and 15 and 16 and 17 and 18. They had bedrooms and best friends and futures. They wanted what everyone wants, and the people who claim to offer it to them are the reason they are gone. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.